Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this presentation. In this essay I'd like to talk about George Custer, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn. Just looking at there's many sources here. It's something that's a battle that's gone into sort of, it's more myth now and legend than reality, but there are many different sources, and all of these sources cite differing reasons for the defeat. Now, just to put some perspective, the total losses in the battle were approximately 500 dead or very seriously wounded and maimed. So we're looking at the idea is, if you listen to the myth or consider the myth, you'd think that tens of thousands, if not millions, died. The total losses on both sides combined, was approximately 500. So now there was roughly 300, give or take, roughly 300 of the U.S. Army and roughly 200 Indians. So that's the proportions here. The combatants in the battle were approximately 3,000. So I suppose in overall proportion of the number of combatants, the deaths were fairly substantial. Now, why was a supposedly professional U.S. Army, drilled and trained, modern weapons, how were they defeated by a bunch of marauding Indians with their bows and arrows? That's the sort of the overview image that comes, I think, into a lot of people's minds. And the reasons for this are cited as various. George Custer was a ego-maniac that behaved rashly and went charging headlong into battle without thinking of how to deploy, whether he had enough resources, whether the ammunition and backup was in place. So we're talking about a headstrong guy who just rushed into things. The second thing also with Custer was that he was given instructions and directions as to what to do, and he ignored, in part at least, those instructions, and at least the sections where he did ignore them turned out to be bigger issues than otherwise were the case. Now, other reasons and causes are put forward, such as the column, the overall column was split up into quite smaller sections, 200 or so, or sometimes less soldiers in each detachment, and because they were widely spread and the coordination was quite poor, and of course these were the days where they couldn't communicate with each other easily. There was no picking up a mobile phone or anything, so they had to assume where their other comrades and detachments might be, and this caused very poor, which it did, by the way, that caused poor or certainly less than optimal coordination, whereas the Indians were gathered really in one place and they could coordinate much more effectively. There are also issues raised with regarding ammunition, that the detachment of the 7th Cavalry that Custer was directly in charge of, or directly commanding, they only had a certain amount of ammunition, and the mule train, if you like, that had the bulk of the ammunition hadn't caught up to them, was separated from them. So they, at the key point in the battle, they ran out of ammunition, and so the outcome was then inevitable. They were simply charged down and killed in hand-to-hand combat. Now, all of these factors, and others, by the way, are relevant to varying degrees. In some recounting and some histories, they tend to place emphasis on, say, Custer not properly following instructions, or rushing headlong, or the ammunition, or so on. So varying, but I think they all played a role, if you like, in the unfolding of this disaster for the U.S. Army, at least. So let's have a look at that, and let's go through some of these things and try and put them in some sort of perspective. Now, the overarching orders that Custer had was to bring the Indians to decisive battle, decisive battle. That was the overall instruction. So all other instructions and activities were subordinate to that key objective. So when sort of any historian or just onlookers, armchair experts look at things, well, Custer should have done this, or why didn't he do that, or he sort of that needs to be kept in place first. That was his overall instruction. You must bring the Indians to decisive battle. Now, decisive battle was a little bit elusive because the Indians would gather together. We're talking Cheyenne and Sioux and so on. The Indians would gather together would quickly assemble to do, perform a military task of some sort, and maybe it's to raid a station or a fort. But then as soon as a major army unit appeared, they would disperse in all directions. And they wouldn't just all run off together as one group. They would just spread all over the place. They would then later regroup somewhere else. But that dispersing meant that the army couldn't pursue them to any useful effect. They could all go chasing after 3 or 4 of them, but then the other 100 or 200 or however many had dispersed in other directions. So the tactics, the doctrine, if you like, of the US Army at the time in dealing with the Indians was to try and surprise them while they were grouped together, and then attack from multiple directions, which would cut off all avenues of escape. And this was key in understanding why the 7th Cavalry and the subsidiary supporting units were distributed so widely into smaller detachments. There was this idea that if they converged from all directions, they could capture the Indians in one group and prevent them from dispersing. This was very much on the minds of the military planners of the day, and it drove their organisation and their structure and their disbursement of resources. The next thing that's very important to consider is that's really not mentioned that much, and I was surprised because it's important. There was a recent engagement in the area between a US Army detachment and Indians, and it kind of ended in a draw, really. It was not decisive in either way, but that officer, who I think was a major, had been given instructions again to achieve decisive battle, and in that respect he'd failed. And he then retreated from the battlefield. Again, an indecisive engagement. He'd retreated, but the retreat or the withdrawal, probably more than retreat, withdrawal is maybe a better word, had turned into a bit of an unruly mess, and they'd left stuff behind on the field and had gone running off in all directions, and it was a bit of an unsightly sort of affair. And he'd been court-martialed, and others had been court-martialed, not just in the Montana area where the Little Bighorn battle took place, but in other places. So this was very much on Custer's mind. Custer was there to pursue glory and to get a promotion and so on. He wasn't there to achieve an indecisive engagement or for that matter, be seen to have failed in some way, which may result in plenty of evidence there that it could result in a court-martial, and he'd be busted down to the rank of captain or lieutenant or something, which for someone of his ego would have been devastating. So this was also on Custer's mind. So as you see Custer organising and arranging and trying to set the whole thing up, those two things are important. He is absolutely focused on seeking decisive battle and preventing the Indians from scattering and dispersing. And he's also terrified that if he fails to gain a decisive battle, that he may suffer a court-martial or some sort of, I don't know, disgrace, I suppose you could call it, where he may be demoted to a lower rank. Now look at other factors, again, that are not in themselves decisive, but they're contributing. A number of the officers reporting directly to Custer didn't like him. They thought he was, a glory-seeking, self-aggrandizing ego-maniac. Some of them believed that they deserved promotions they hadn't got, and they believed Custer had been over-promoted or had been promoted ahead of them, that he was only in that position because he was some sort of show pony rather than a capable military officer. So these views were held by some of the majors and the captains that were in the detachments, the multiple detachments that reported into Custer. So this too, because there were a number of units where you could argue that they dragged their feet and didn't come with all haste to the battlefield, and had they done so, then the outcome might have been different. You could say an extra 300 soldiers with their ammunition could potentially have been on the battlefield alongside Custer in the battle, or maybe not 300, but certainly 200. So this would potentially, if they'd arrived with ammunition and they'd arrived early enough, this could have certainly changed the outcome. At least they would have turned it into, say, a draw or something, which again may not have been good enough for Custer because it would have failed to bring about a decision. But nonetheless, and the officers that appeared to be dragging their feet were the same ones that didn't think much of Custer. So you could argue that there's certainly a factor there. Now, I've seen this in business where when you're trying to achieve an objective and marshalling, directing resources and people to try and achieve that objective, that sometimes you'll find someone seems to be engaging in sort of slow sabotage, and not overtly, it's quite covert, but slow sabotage. And I've nailed a few people for it over the years. Why did you deliberately try and fuck that up? That type of thing. And if you press them hard enough, they'd say, I didn't want to, excuse me, I didn't want to do that because it would make Billy Bob or Jimmy Jack look good, and I hate Billy Bob, or I think Jimmy Jack's an asshole, and so on. So you do get this thing of covert sabotage and foot dragging, so there may have been, and I think there may have been those that wanted wanted Custer to be embarrassed, if you like, by the outcome, but they didn't want to do it so overtly that they could be accused of not doing their job or not following instructions and so on. So those are the consideration. Now the final consideration was the intelligence. The intelligence that Custer was operating on was that there were somewhere in the region of 800 Indian warriors in the area, and that he was given resources to deal with that. And again, the splitting up of the units under Custer's command was to prevent the Indians dispersing as they typically did. Now, you could say in strict military doctrine, hey, that's pretty dumb. You're dividing up the resources you have into quite small units, between 100 and 200 sort of men per unit, and around 30% of those men have very limited military experience. Most of the officers do, but there's a number of the officers' positions, particularly at lieutenant and second lieutenant type level, that haven't been filled, and some of the people in the logistical and support side of things have no experience at all. So these are issues. The idea that they are all Civil War veterans and heroes, that's not true. There were a number of them there. Most of the officers were, by the way. Not all, but most of the officers did have military experience, particularly as the more senior captain and above. But at junior captain, lieutenant and below, not so many. And again, areas like logistical support and sergeants and so on, they weren't all experienced military men. So dispersing the units was a direct extension of that military doctrine. If you have to stop the Indians from scattering and dispersing, that was why that was there. Under ideal conditions, you wouldn't have separated the units. You'd have marched as one unit or maybe two or something, but you'd have had a big enough force that could have acted independently against the enemy. Now let's suppose that the intelligence said that there's approximately 800 Indian warriors there. Now the number of actual warriors is about 3 times that in reality. So the resources that they were bringing to bear on the battle overall weren't really enough for that. If they were super disciplined, they'd all arrived as one unit or all arrived at the same time, roughly the same time, then they probably could have prevailed. But when you're expecting, or you've been told by intelligence it's around 800 and there's really 2,500 plus, then it's a completely different ball game. The other factor involved was that the Indians would have hardly any weapons, as in modern weapons, repeating rifles and so on. And whatever rifles they had, they wouldn't have much ammunition. This proved to be untrue. according to the people who survived and so on, that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the Indians had the Winchester and repeating rifles. This is the older Civil War models, the repeating rifles. Now, these weren't that accurate at a distance, but they were useful in volley fire. The Indians didn't have the discipline to do volley fire, but they were nonetheless modern weapons. Now, the bow and arrow was only accurate, or usefully accurate, in, say, 30 to 40 yards, and in that type, maybe 30 to 50 yards, it was accurate in that range. So again, if you volley fired sort of clouds of arrows, that would, but there weren't enough, that the Indians weren't sort of disciplined and in tight enough groups to deliver those clouds of arrows. So, but the rifles could offer a longer distance shot, so they could be, say, closer to 100 yards away. Now, the weapons that the carbines and so on that the 7th Cavalry had were, they weren't all repeating rifles, by the way, but they were a better quality rifle. They were accurate over a longer distance, 500-600 yards. But they had a particular cartridge that often meant that after several shots, you would have to stop and engage in maintenance to clean out the barrel and the breech and this sort of stuff before you could start shooting again. That could, even for a skilled operator, that could take a few minutes. Now, when you're in the heat of battle and suddenly your rifle stops for a few minutes, that's a big deal. Now the amount of ammunition that each trooper had was not enough for a battle. The assumption was that they would carry enough bullets, not only for the rifle but for their pistol, their sidearms, their pistol. They would carry enough ammunition to deliver a first engagement, but then support ammunition would be distributed from the pack mules that were carrying the major part of the supplies. Now this got separated so that when the actual battle was engaged at Little Bighorn, for most of the time there, in fact pretty much all of it, the only ammunition they had was the ammunition they brought with them. The rest of the ammunition either hadn't arrived, or for the amount of support ammunition they had, they lost the horses. The horses panicked and scattered. For example, when the troopers dismounted to engage in rifle fire, at the Little Bighorn, one trooper would be assigned to hold the 4 horses, and 3 of the troopers would then engage. So straight away, something in the order of 20 to 25% of the troopers, because it was all done on the fly, it wasn't pre-organised, there wasn't a defensive sort of perimeter created or anything. They had to hold the horses. Now, as the battle began and bullets were flying and so on, the horses panicked, and the one man trying to hold the reins of them couldn't hold them. So a lot of those horses, with their ammunition, then ran off. So the view is that as much as half the ammunition that was available in that first engagement to the 7th Cavalry was lost when the horses ran away, or you had troopers trying to chase the horses to get the ammunition, and the pack mules at that point hadn't arrived, and where the ammunition had arrived, it couldn't be distributed. So these were certainly key issues, particularly as the high point or the zenith of the battle was joined. So now, coming to the issue of Custer not following his orders, Custer was ordered by the general to make a wide sweep of the valley to make sure there was no Indians there, and to try and funnel them into the main area that the converging columns were to attack. Again, it's part of this thing of not allowing the Indians to disperse and scatter and to cut off their escape routes. Now, when Custer heard that there was a concentration of Indians around that Little Bighorn area, he stopped the wide sweep down the valley and instead headed directly for, or took a more direct route rather. So he cut off the sweeping of the valley and started heading towards where the scouts had said the main body of Indians were. Now again, come back to his original orders. You must seek decisive battle. So he's got an order that you do a wide sweep of the valley to make sure there's no Indians there, but you must seek decisive battle. And intelligence says, well, that's where the Indians have grouped. So, if you were the commanding officer of this detachment and intelligence, the scouts come back and tell you, well, that's where the action is, you would head towards that. You wouldn't say, well, I won't bother about that. I'll continue doing a sweep of the valley. And you don't know there's any Indians in the valley. That's just a sort of you're feeling it all out and having a look and scouting around. You don't know. So it could be time lost and non-productive time spent, whereas you now have clear intelligence from your own scouts that that's where the main body of Indians are. So you would do that too, given your overall orders. And remember, always come back to this, your overall orders are to seek decisive battle. And so Custer stopped the sweeping of the valley and started heading in a direct route towards Little Bighorn. He's faulted for this frequently. Again, the egomaniac, glory-seeking, glory-hunting, sort of out of control. I don't agree with that. I think most, given the overall orders, again, to seek decisive battle, I think most military officers would have done that. Unless something had been found in the valley that he's doing a wide sweep on, which there was huge evidence of lots of Indian activity, then you may continue doing it. But at this stage, there isn't that evidence. The scouts aren't coming back and saying that. There's some, the Indians have been there in the past, but is there anything today or right now that they're scouting out that looks like it's worth following up? Well, no is the answer. So again, you would do, given the information you have at that time, at that moment, and your overall instructions, you too, if you were the officer in charge, would seek decisive battle, which is what Custer did. So he starts heading towards Little Bighorn. Now, the other issue that's I think important is that and remember, Custer has some sort of discretion, particularly where joining battle is concerned. Once the issue of joining battle is concerned, then Custer has much greater discretion than so he can deviate from his orders based on local conditions and circumstances and developments of the moment, which is quite reasonable, by the way. He's the guy in charge on the ground. So he's going along to Little Bighorn, and he has that discretion to seek out battle, which is exactly what he's doing. But on the communication side of things, he's sending scouts or riders along to go and find the other units that are dispersed, the other detachments that are dispersed around. So he's telling them, look, it's a change of plan. Instead of doing this, I'm now going to do that, as in head towards Little Bighorn. So I now want you to do this or such and such. So these riders go, now, they don't know exactly where the other columns are. They can find them and follow the trail and they'll get there. But Custer doesn't know how long it's going to take those riders to find the other detachments. And now he's giving orders to them which are sort of more general than micro-specific. So he's giving orders and he's handing it over to somebody. Often these orders are verbal, by the way. And so the rider catches up the other column and says, well, Colonel Custer has said to do such and such and so and so. And there'll probably be an interpretation of things added, maybe an embellishment or a ginning up or something like that. Then the officer receiving the orders has to then decipher them and say, well, okay, what does he actually want then? Oh, he wants me to come down this way and do this and do that. Okay, well that's I plan to do so and so, so we better need to stop. We need to have a meeting with our officers here, make sure the men are, because we've started marching early to go in that direction, we're now going to have a break for breakfast or something like that, which the men are expecting. They've been up since before sunup. So we're going to stop here. That'll all take an hour, and then we'll start moving. Well, we can't go down that way because that's all thick forest. So we'll have to cut around this way, and then we'll go down. So the local conditions and circumstances, and where was the unit at the time that received the fresh instructions from Custer? It wasn't in a good position. It couldn't just go, oh yeah, okay, we'll go down that way. That's we'll go down this road instead of that road. That was, they'd have had to go around the mountain and over this and under that, and cross the river, and the river was running too deep, and they had to put a pontoon bridge up. That took out. So there's a whole lot of factors go into this. You don't just push a button and suddenly they go in another direction. So there's preparation and so on to be done, and a reorganisation. Again, the officers had to be called in and told, well, this is what our new instructions are. We're going to do this and that, and so on. So and at the same time, the key units that would have made a difference to Little Bighorn, these are the same guys who didn't think much of Custer. Now, it's hard to say whether they thought that his military capability was suspect. That doesn't seem to be the issue here. That he's a glory hunter, that's one thing that comes up. And the suggestion that because he is a glory hunter, that would compromise his military decision making. That's a valid point to some extent. But really the criticism of him is by these other officers is he got promoted ahead of them. They weren't promoted when they think they should have. So it's petty professional jealousy, that sort of stuff. And also that they think he's... and some of them don't like him. One of the officers, who I think was originally from Germany or Holland, he looked at Custer as being just some two-bit show pony, which was wrong. When he was dismissed as being some two-bit ego-maniac, and therefore his instructions or his orders were to be, I'll follow the money because I have to, only because I might get court-martialed if I don't, but why should I follow the instructions of this moron? That type of thing. And that's not helpful. So the guy was doing as he was told, but with such a foot-dragging reluctance that you could almost argue that he was deliberately sabotaging the operation. But anyway, so these units then started to converge and come towards Little Bighorn. They were moving much more slowly and ponderously than Custer had imagined. And so, whereas he would have anticipated they were much closer to the battle than they were, which would have encouraged him to charge headlong into battle, assuming that he would very shortly be supported. Now, failure of Custer to understand the intelligence that he was seeing. Now again, Custer was no amateur. It wasn't like he joined the army yesterday. So trails were being noticed by the scouts, some of which Custer actually saw firsthand. Trails were being noticed where the normal width of, say, a single tribe, the trails that they would leave would typically be 100 yards, 150 yards wide, give or take, and there was a certain size of an Indian camp, and you could read, and again, some of these guides were quite experienced in Indian tracking and so on. So it wasn't like they were beginners or just come out of some training school. That they had serious on the ground experience. So they knew how big a trail and a campsite one tribe would leave, and some of the trails that they were coming across were 1,000 or even 2,000 yards wide. So this clearly indicated quite a large host was moving around. This wasn't just a few here and a few there. The other thing that they noticed was the tracks, where they were smaller, the tracks were converging rather than diverging, meaning that there was obviously a gathering of people there. Similarly, they would look at campsites, which tended to be almost a standardized sort of size, but the campsites, there were a number of campsites in close proximity, and again the wide trail as much as 2,000 yards wide. So this was clearly a lot of people moving around. Now Custer suspected the intelligence that he was given of 800 warriors, Indian warriors there, was incorrect. He in fact doubled it. So he said if they say 800, it's probably closer to 13 to 1,500 was Custer's view. But he didn't expect it would be 2,500 to 3,000 warriors. That he didn't anticipate. Now, when the scouts, again, some of which Custer saw, when the scouts came back and said, look, some of these trails are like 2,000 yards wide. This is a lot of people moving around. This is a big host that's starting to gather. That should have set off an alarm in Custer's, you would think. Now, it seems Custer took the reverse view, that means there's a lot more Indians than we thought, which means there's more glory to be had. There's a major decisive battle to be had here, and huge glory and aggrandizement and so on. So it seems he took the reverse view, rather than say, "Holy crap! There's going to be up to 3,000 warriors here." We don't really have enough resources for that. We better hold position. Make sure all the units come in together, and that this is very tightly coordinated. We can't afford to screw up here. This must be very tightly coordinated if we're going to win this battle or achieve again the decisive victory he's under orders to seek out. But instead of that, he didn't make the adjustments and didn't tighten up the coordination and tighten up the logistics and make sure it was all on point. Instead of that, it whetted his appetite for seeking out the battle that would bring even greater glory than he'd first imagined. That would at least seem to be how he was thinking it through. Now, one of the scouts who survived the battle recounts that he told Custer, "Look, there's going to be a lot more Indians here than we imagine. Look at the size of these trails, and look how many trails, and look how they're all converging. Shouldn't we really reevaluate our position here and do some more detailed scouting out ahead before we go any further?" And Custer ignored him and didn't answer him, and And when other officers suggested that they maybe reconsider, again Custer dismissed this. And this has become probably as much an issue of anything else, where this is the headstrong egomaniac going charging in. But again, I come back to his original instructions: find where the Indians are and seek out decisive battle. And that's exactly what he's doing. He's following his instructions there. Now, should he have tightened up the coordination and tightened up the organisation? Well, yes, I don't think there's any doubt about that. He doesn't know exactly how many Indians are there in Little Bighorn, or at the Little Bighorn, but he knows there's going to be a lot more than 800, and probably exceeding his estimates, which were 1,500. But still, he goes ahead. So you'd say that was overreach, and that he should have been far more prudent. Others say that, well, clearly he was a very confident commander, confident in his own abilities, confident in the abilities of his men, and so on and so forth, and confident that the other units would arrive in time to join in. Now, had those other units come along from all those different directions and they'd arrived at exactly the right time and so on, it probably would have resulted in a very decisive engagement in favour of the US Army, but only if that happened. So Custer was really this was a gambler's throw of major proportions, and as a lot of military engagements are, by the way, and Custer's, again, not unusual in that he was confidently hoping for the best. Now, if we look at the battle once it's engaged, a Little Bighorn, given the amount of Indian warriors and the amount of them that have rifles, and that they have plentiful ammunition, and that Custer's men are outnumbered by 10 to 1, and they have limited ammunition, then the outcome was pretty much obvious. You could tell what was going to happen. The US Army unit lost all discipline and so on, and as you would expect from this, and Custer was killed alongside many others of them there. So around 300 were killed. I guess what's a little surprising is they were able to inflict so few casualties on the Indians. The claim is that the Indian casualties were about 200 to the US Army 300. So that strikes me as a little bit odd, but and it suggests that they did run out of ammunition much earlier than some of the accounts indicate. And bear in mind the revolvers that they had, because when they ran out of rifle ammunition, which they ran out of first, they then switched to their revolvers, and there was still quite a few bullets recovered that hadn't been put in the revolvers, suggesting that the soldiers, once they switched to their revolvers, which weren't very accurate, beyond say a 10-metre range, that they were being charged down by the Indians. And when you've got to stop and reload a pistol, which doesn't take that long, but when you're in the heat of battle and someone's running towards you with a spear or something, even a few seconds is a long time. So that would suggest that they switched to the revolvers when they ran out of rifle ammunition, which happened fairly early on, it looks like. Then they switched to their sidearms, the revolvers, the pistols, and these were ineffective. They were really a close quarters weapon, and the moment they had to reload, they were charged down and killed. So that's quite the number of Indians. Casualties 200 versus the US Forces Army of 300. That would indicate that they ran out of ammunition. They just got charged down or picked off at a distance by rifles, whereas the Indians had plentiful ammunition. But not all the Indians had the rifles, so there was still plenty of evidence of arrows and knives and lances and so on. So anyway, that's my take on the Battle of Little Bighorn. So in summary, Custer probably was an egomaniac, but I don't think that compromised his military judgment to an excessive degree. Was he surprised by the number of Indians at Little Bighorn? Well, there's no question that he would have been, but by that stage they'd been noticed and seen, so they'd lost all element of surprise. They really had no option other than either stand and fight or retreat, which would have meant the Indians could have picked off the other columns one by one. So that once Custer had arrived at the Little Bighorn and been spotted, and the engagement was in the process of beginning, he had no option at that point, I believe, but to stay and fight it out. Could he hope that the other units would have arrived in time? Well, sure, but they didn't. So that was it. His unit, or the one he was directly in charge of at least, got wiped out, which was an inevitable outcome once that battle had engaged. So what could have Custer done beforehand to create a different outcome? there's only really one thing that comes out is once the scouts had identified the large tracks, again 2,000 metres wide track. I mean, that's a lot of people moving along there. Once that had been identified, Custer should have stopped at that point and reorganised based on, hold on a minute, there's going to be a lot more warriors, Indian warriors, than we thought there was going to be. So we need to readjust, we need to recalibrate our organisation and make sure the coordination was really tight. The mule trains with ammunition were right in the middle of to really tighten the whole thing up. That was all he could have done at that point. Now, he didn't know how many more warriors there were going to be there or how well equipped they would be with rifles. That he didn't know. But nonetheless, that lack of intelligence should have in itself caused him to hesitate and to just make sure that everything had been nailed down tight. So we are looking at someone that charged in unprepared or not adequately prepared for the circumstances that came along. But once he'd appeared on the battlefield and realised the extent of his underestimation, then it was too late. His options had suddenly been limited. So he had one chance of recalibrating based on, again, the expectation there'd be far more Indian warriors there than there actually, there'd be far more Indian numbers of Indian warriors there than he'd originally imagined. And this was really at that point. And once he passed that point, the options had gone, and then the outcome was inevitable. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.